again, since it's the same people. Thanks, Brian, for recording, but we're very happy to have Mike joining us again this week after a great presentation on Monday with the videos and stimulated discussion on value added for agriculture. So I won't take any of his time again, because we've heard that he's had lots of experience in this domain, being former vice president of Parrish and Heimbecker, formerly Ellison's and Maple Leaf Foods and so on. So very well qualified to talk about value added. So I'll just turn it over to you, Mike.
Okay. To our students that are here today, and I can't see you all, I can only see Vitor. How many were at Monday's session?
I think they were all there. The three.
Oh, okay. Well, just as a fun thing, I did give you just a little quick bit of homework where I asked you about the quote, "You are what you eat," and to give me some examples. And I'm just curious how many examples you came up with. 2, 3, 4. So anyway, I can't hear you, but anyway, so let's just go to the question. This is a question that way back in my university days, I took a few nutrition courses, and this seemed to be one of the favorite nutrition questions that seem to come up all the time. So if we go to the first slide, Brian, or move up one, please.
Michael, I was going to suggest maybe have the students put their answers into the chat, and we can kind of revisit them later.
Okay.
I just saw Graham Drake put pizza in. That was my answer. And the reason pizza is what I eat is because I'm kind of a mixed up person anyway, and I like everything on it.
Well, here's about 10 different things that are examples of how what you are is what you eat. And let's say, I thought it'd just be a fun way to kick off today's session. The food we eat plays a bigger part in our lives than I think we might realize. And well, the first one is literally, you are what you eat. And what I mean by literally, the fats, the proteins, the calcium, the water, the nutrients are the building blocks of your body. And your body contains, now listen to this number, 6,700 trillion atoms. That's quite the number. And the Davidson Institute recently put out a study that showed that of your body, 63% is hydrogen, 24% is oxygen. So you know what a hydrogen and oxygen is, that's water. So that makes up like 87% of your body, 12% carbon, 1% nitrogen, with a few traces of calcium and phosphorus. So the food you eat is literally the building blocks of your body. The next one I have is nationality. And, some of them have changed over the years, but I would suggest that if you're eating Yorkshire pudding, there's a good chance you're English. If you're eating haggis, you might be Scottish. Obviously, if you eat a lot of rice, you might be Chinese, Japanese. Pierogies, you might be from Eastern Europe. Asado foods, you might be Argentinian. So a lot of your foods that you eat are, depend on your nationality. There's also religion. I would suggest that if you're not eating pork, you might be Jewish because it has to be kosher. If you're halal, you might be Muslim according to Sharia law. And maybe one that's a little more familiar to us. If you eat fish on Friday, you might just be a good Catholic. As far as weight, well, pretty simple thing. If you eat too much, you grow too much. The more you eat, if you're not burning it off, you're going to be a big person. And I read that the National Center for Health Sciences put out a study just recently. Now, this is an American study, and it found that adults in the United States, 20 and over, 42% of them are obese, and 74% are overweight. The next one is health. If you eat healthy foods, you're going to have a healthy body. And a recent Harvard study showed that if you eat better, which is a bit nebulous, but if you eat better, in men, you could probably live an extra 12 years. And if you're women, you could probably eat about 14 years longer. Now, eat better. Now, and that's just basically a common sense thing. You know, lots of fruits and vegetables, moderate carbs, no fatty foods or few fatty foods, limit your red meat, limit your alcohol. The next one is festivity. And if you're eating a birthday cake, you're probably a birthday boy or a birthday girl. Age. If you're eating pablum, you're probably a baby. If you're drinking Kool-Aid, you're probably a kid. If you're having a slug of Ensure every now and then, you're probably up in years. Intelligence. Two things to this thing. If you're making smart food choices, you probably are a fairly sharp person, or well-informed is probably a better way to say it. And in fact, the second part of that is some foods, recent studies have indicated, actually can tend to make you a bit sharper and have better memory powers. Income. Well, if you're eating expensive foods, you're probably a little on the rich side. Sadly, if you're eating cheap food, you're probably not doing so well in as far as income goes. And then last but not least, there's just other things, concerns. If you're concerned about things, you're probably taking a hard look at what you're eating in terms of organics or no gluten or low salt. You're a concerned person because you're making food choices based on your concerns. So that was just a little fun thing I thought you'd enjoy with regards to, you know, what you eat is what you are. So moving on to the next slide. One of the topics that we're going to talk about today is consumer concerns and how they impact on farmers, processors, and in the ag business in general. Next slide, please, Brian. So, okay, get her up a little bit. Okay. So some of the topics that I picked out as challenges for the farm community. The number one and the biggest one, misinformation. I'd like to talk a little bit about production practices with regards to fertilizers and insecticides. We're going to talk a bit about animal rights, traceability, GMOs, sustainability, land costs, and lastly, climate change. So let's go to the next slide, please, Brian. There's a lot of misinformation out there, not just in agribusiness. There's misinformation everywhere in our lives today, and it can get very frustrating. I think it's causing a lot of problem in society. Certainly don't know what the example or what the solution is in a lot of cases, but looking at the ag industry, as far as misinformation goes, it is a changing farm community. And in the old days, most everyone either lived on a farm or knew someone who did. I know as a child growing up, I didn't grow up on a farm, but I had two uncles that both had farms, and I can think of many, many happy moments in my childhood when we were out there amongst the cows or driving tractors or playing in the barns with my cousins. So my point is, there was a day that everybody kind of had a sense of what goes on a farm. And going back and looking at statistics, in 1860 in North America, 60% of the population lived on a farm. In 1900, it was down to 32%, or about a third. In 1950, about 16% of our population lived on the farm. And today, it's less than 2%. So I guess the point is, when people who aren't familiar with farms, and there's a lot of people out there who aren't familiar with farming, they hear words like factory farms or antibiotics or hormones. And these words tend to scare people, basically because they're not as informed as perhaps we'd like them to be. Now, let's just talk about a few of those. if you talk about antibiotics, also known as antimicrobials, they've been widely used in our on our farm since the 50s. 72% of them are used to prevent disease and for growth promotion. All antibiotics must meet strict government guidelines. Testing is ongoing. Producers work with their veterinarians to ensure levels are set that ensure withdrawal periods are good prior to the animal entering the food supply. Antibiotics do increase carcass quality, they improve feed efficiencies, and most importantly, they prevent the animals from getting sick. Now let's talk about growth hormones. Again, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and there's a lot of, shall we say, retailers or restaurants that part of their advertising is our food does not contain growth hormones. Well, again, they are approved for cattle and a bit of sheep. There was a study done by some Canadian pathologists, I won't pronounce their names right, Ajuri Awera and Van Lunen, who did a study a few years back, I guess it was in 2005, and they suggested that there was no direct link between feeding antibiotics to animals and negative health effects in humans. Now, with that, I happen to have a niece who got her doctorate in animal science a few years back, and when she hears about antibiotics, she kind of snickers, because she told me one time, and maybe she was exaggerating, she says, Uncle Mike, you'd have to eat about 80 cows in one sitting before you could ever be impacted. So I think some of the concerns about growth hormones might just be overblown. The other thing too about growth hormones is they allow the animal to mature quicker, and if they mature quicker, that's less feed that has to go into them. Less feed that goes into the animals leaves more food for us in other ways. The other thing that we hear about every now and then is grass-fed animals versus conventional. Granted, grass-fed might be more nutritional, but it's also probably more expensive. And people, when grass-fed, it usually means open range, but they could be just simply being fed grass in a confined space. We like to think of these animals out in the prairie, lots of room and fresh air, but that's not always the case. Conventional feed for beef does tend to be fatter, but it does have better marbling, and it's less expensive. So there's some trade-offs involved there. Another thing that gets kicked around is free range. And again, we think about, some chickens out in the prairie and got lots of room and sunshine and everything's fine. But the definition of free range technically is that they must have, it's just simply this, they must have outside access. But there's no guidelines on how long they stay outdoors and how big their outdoor cage is. So it's, a little misleading. And again, we think of all these happy chickens roaming around, but that just might not be the case, even though they are defined as being free range. And again, free range is more expensive than conventional. And just one last thing, I was in the feed business for a few years, and I can remember one of my colleagues talking one day, and I don't, this isn't probably going to come across right, but chickens have a brain about the size of a pea. Now, so does a salmon. And you're concerned about the welfare of a chicken, but every one of us has seen piles of salmon piled up on the deck of a boat or laying on the dock as they just basically die from lack of oxygen. So it's just a little, sometimes I wonder, we're concerned about one, but maybe not so concerned about the other. It's kind of an interesting take. Next thing, next slide, please, Brian. I want to talk a little bit about fertilizers, insecticides, and herbicides, and I do stress I'm not an expert in any of these. The obvious benefits of fertilizers, insecticide, herbicide is increased production. The soil structure is improved. Insects and disease are reduced, and pastures are improved such that the animals fatten up quicker. And again, all chemicals are highly researched, tested, and regulated. And most of these chemicals undergo years of tests and research before they're allowed to get out in the marketplace. Next slide, please. But people do have concerns. Air, water, and soil pollution. There's also an ongoing concern about the ozone layer being thin because of this. And just as a side note, I know that from my flour milling experience, every year we used to have an annual fumigation, and we used to just basically seal up the plant and let out a gas called methyl bromide, which was extremely toxic, and it would kill everything in your plant. But it was a bit, as you can appreciate, it was a bit dangerous. You always had a fear that somehow one of your employees might get exposed to it. But as time went on, the powers to be basically came out of the federal government. We're very concerned about, as were a lot of governments, were concerned about what methyl bromide would do to the atmosphere, particularly the ozone layer. And so it got phased out by law. And so two things happened. We had to find alternatives. And in the case of my experience, we turned to heat treatment, where again, you just simply seal up the plant. Then you just bring in high-end heaters and heat the plant up to about 180 degrees. And that would kill all the bugs in your plant. Along with that, it became very apparent that sometimes using methyl bromide, it was kind of the lazy man's way of getting rid of your bugs. It became more and more apparent that just day-to-day sanitation, keeping the dust, the flower dust and whatnot out of your plant, was a big help in reducing any bug infestations. So the next slide, please, Brian. Some of the solutions that are available with regards to fertilizers is, number one is education. Just ensuring that the people that are applying them are fully aware of how to apply them, when to apply them, what dosages, what times a year. Secondly is pretty simple. It's just simply reducing the amount, because as I say, there is a tendency at times people just overuse some of these chemicals. And lastly, there's alternatives using non-toxic, natural, or organic fertilizers. Next slide, please, Brian. Next thing I want to talk about is a little bit is animal rights, which is a concern of many consumers. And I think in our lifetimes, we've all seen that society's perspective has changed. I think people care more about animals today than perhaps what they have in the past. Protective laws have been enhanced over the years. And I'll talk a bit more in a minute about how it just makes simple business sense. But I can say that I did work in the meat industry for 17 years. And sadly, I'm going to say this honestly, I did see a fair amount of animal abuse. And it wasn't because we had mean people that hated animals or didn't care about them. It was just kind of the way it was. Simple things like a load of hogs would show up the back door of the slaughter plant. Whoever drove the truck would just immediately get in the back of the trailer with the hogs and just start kicking them to get them out the door. Or worse yet, have a cattle prod. And I hate to say this, but sometimes you'd have a pig with a broken hip, broken leg, could hardly move. And somebody would just simply take the cattle prod to it, and get this poor animal to drag itself up the ramp. That just doesn't happen anymore. And getting back to my other point, taking care of your animals, people are starting to realize it makes good business sense to be very careful how you treat them, how you care for them. I mentioned earlier, my niece had her doctorate in animal science, and her thesis was in animal transportation. She did a lot of studies of moving cattle from feedlots to the slaughterhouse. And what she found in her thesis was that the more humane you are, the easier you make it on animals, the less stressful you make the transportation, it simply results in better weights and quality meat. No dark cutters and whatnot. So a lot of producers are starting to realize this. And just little things. I used to note that we did a fair amount of dairy business down in the Pacific Northwest, and you'd always go into dairy barns where cattle were getting milked, and invariably there was music playing. In P&H, this is kind of a funny story. I can remember being in an egg laying facility one time. We literally had, I think it was 80,000 hens laying eggs. And every now and then you'd hear this rooster crow. And we asked the question, like, why do you have a rooster in here with all these egg laying hens? And they basically said, well, the hens like to hear the rooster cock-a-doodle-doo every now and then. It just makes them feel a little better. So anyway, so the takeaway on this is animal rights have been getting better, and I think you're going to see them to get much better as we move into the future. The next one is traceability, which again is a concern about a lot of consumers. I remember traveling in Europe a number of years ago, long before this was going on in Canada, and being in a grocery store one day and looking at ground beef. And right on the packages of the ground beef was the date of the birth of the animal. And I just thought to myself, wow, that's phenomenal. How do they ever figure that out? But it can be done. Now, the dictionary tells us that traceability in supply chain traceability is the ability to identify, track, and trace elements of a product or substance as it moves along the supply chain from raw goods to finished products. Traceability puts a clear onus on farmers to create and keep clear records. And I should add, next slide, please, Brian. And traceability, and I think we'll touch on it a bit later, applies to food processing also. The benefits of traceability are many, not just, well, the main one is that you're giving your consumers trust and transparency. The other one, or part of that too, is if you have good traceability, there's fewer mysteries when problems occur. Because I know in my experience, every now and then you'd end up with a bad production lot, something was wrong with it, and you just couldn't figure out, where did this happen? When did it? Why? Traceability helps you clear up a lot of these things. It allows you to streamline your supply chain and minimize losses. And what I mean by that is, so often if you had a problem with a day's production, you'd end up having to dump the whole day's production. Whereas if you've got good traceability, you can grind your rate down to, oh, this is when it happened. It happened exactly at 9:30 to 10:30. So instead of having to dump out the whole day's production, you only have to dump out or rework about an hour's production. You can also, with traceability, prove your safety and purity of your product. It ensures seamless compliance with export regulations. It allows you to prove to any sort of regulator that you've been following standards, and you can communicate your certifications and ethical practices. It ensures better internal quality monitoring, and you can minimize returns and reputation risks. So obviously with plants, with good traceability, and this is just a snapshot, whatever you plant, you can you can document what was planted, when it was planted, the type of seed, the fertilizer, the herbicide, who did the work, dates, times of everything. And similarly with animals, most animals, a lot of them get tagged with an ID. You get their date of birth, the type of feed, medication, locations, date of shipment, et cetera, et cetera. So the next one, please, Brian. GMOs. Oh, I should add that picture of that young fellow there happens to be my son, who's got his doctorate in plant genetics. I should have him talking to you today because he did a lot of work in, or been doing a lot of work in genetics, mostly in canola. But surprisingly, that plant he's got in front of him is actually a tobacco plant. And I didn't know this, but they use tobacco plants in a lot of genetic testing because the leaves are big, they're easy to read, they're easy to process, easy to analyze and whatnot. But anyway, GMOs, as we probably know, are genetically modified organisms. And the question is, are they safe? Well, GMOs have been tested far more than any other food. Over the last 30 years, there has been no evidence that GMOs are harmful to people. The safety of GMOs is widely agreed upon by the scientific community, with more than 275 global science organizations coming to the same conclusion that GMOs are as safe as non-GMOs. Now, that said, over the years, I've lost track of how many times I've been to a party or a function, and somebody has come up to me and started giving me a hard time about, in my case, GMO wheat. And I would, as quick as I could, tell them, well, we do not use GMO wheat. And I'll take it one step further. There is no GMO wheat in the world, with the exception of perhaps some being held in various research centers here and there. But problem with GMOs, and it's a misinformation thing, is, quite frankly, you tell them there's no GMO wheat in North America or the world, well, they wouldn't believe you. Now, that said, there are a lot of plants that are supposedly GMOs, but in the case of wheat, there aren't any. Can I have the next slide, please? The next topic is sustainability. And the definition is sustainability in agriculture is one that produces abundant food without depleting the earth's resources or depleting or polluting the environment. It is agriculture that follows the principles of nature to form systems for raising crops and livestock that are, like nature, self-sustaining. So, next slide, please, Brian. So, how do farmers achieve sustainability? Well, there's a number of ways. First one that comes to mind is simply summer fallow, which basically you don't plant anything in a certain area and you let the ground rest, if you will, and it increases the depleted fertility while it lies fallow. Another way to get better sustainability is crop rotation. Steady rotation, when you don't plant the same crop, the soil has a chance to reap the nutrients it needs rather than depleting them. The use of cover crops can help with sustainability because it protects against the weeds and winds and helps retain nutrients. You avoid tillage. It reduces soil loss, and no-till planting has become very common anymore. You can intermingle livestock and crops. Historically, we kept them separate to some extent, but rotating lots lets the soil refurbish itself. And the other one too here is integrated pest management. And this is more of the long-term prevention of pests to increase sustainability. And there's a number of them. One of them is biological control, and basically the introduction of a parasitic animal to get rid of the pest. And some examples would be bringing in parasitic wasps to devour aphids, or introducing parasitoids, which a bug where the larvae basically gets into the host, like insects, and basically kills the pest. The use of healthier seeds can lead to better sustainability. Dry season plowing allows for better aeration. Simple ones, removal of infected or rogue plants. And sometimes reducing irrigation can help. Wetness can lead to mold, which is not good. And last but not least, some simple ones, just putting out traps for rodents to keep them from getting at your crop. Okay, the next challenge or concern that I'm not too sure that the consumer has a big concern about this, but farmers certainly have a concern, is the challenge of ever increasing land costs. Well, what can I say? In the old days, farming was a way of life, but now it's truly a profession. My grandfather came over from Ireland years ago, first part of the last century, and before he left, he was a baker's assistant. He came over to Canada and became a farmer, and I've always wondered, well, what training did he have? You know, my point is, with the land costs going up, really need to have farmers who are better educated and more business-like, and that's obviously the case as time has gone on over the years. Now, I don't have the answer to rising costs. There's a limited supply of farmland and an ever-increasing demand. Family farms are becoming corporate farms. And as I say, due to high costs, farmers must be more efficient. They must be better educated. And as we talk, and we must embellish and use our value chains much more. And we talked about value chains the other day. So again, I don't have the solution to land costs. If you look at the chart there on the left, you can just see how much the land has gone up per year over the last few years, anywhere from what 4.8 to 7.3, and even the last couple of years, it's even higher. It is interesting to note that in North America, approximately 40% of farmland is actually leased. And of all that, probably about 30% of that leased land is owned by retired farmers. And there's a simple case there. Dad is retiring, and for whatever reason, the kids aren't taking things over, whether they don't want to or they can't afford to. Okay, the next one, climate change. We hear a lot about climate change. It's getting to be a bigger and bigger concern all the time. And it's going to have a big impact on agriculture in the years ahead. The first one there is drought. There's going to be times when water is not going to be available, and there's going to be far more reliance on irrigation systems. Farmers are going to have more weather concerns, whether it be wildfires or flooding or hailstorms or tornadoes. There's going to be increases in invasive species. Pests are coming north. They're surviving the winters easier. We're seeing wetter springs and drier summers with varying thaw and frost dates. Seeing more power outages as time goes on. There's impacts on our pollinators, bees, birds. Big concern about bees these days, about what's happening to their numbers. And there could be overall poor yields due to heat stress. So it is imperative that this world gets climate change under control. I think we could probably talk a long time about that one. And again, I don't have all the answers. So these are some of the challenges in the farm community. Now let's move on to the next slide and we'll talk a bit about food processors. And again, one of the big concerns is misinformation, food safety, traceability, GMOs again, and organics. Well, sometimes just the word processed food gets a bad rap. So I thought we should just talk about what is food processing. The Dietary Guidelines for America defines food processing to any raw agricultural commodity or product that has been subjected to processing, such as canning, cooking, freezing, dehydration, or milling. It's also defined as food changed in nutritional composition with fortifying, preserving, or preparing in different ways. To break it down, it's any food that has been changed from its original raw form. So when we talk about, hey, processed foods are bad for you for whatever reason, I think we need to talk about what kind of processed feeds. And there's various degrees of processing. There's minimally processed foods like sliced fruits, bagged salad, leafy greens. Sometimes they contain some additives for preservation. One example I always think of is how bananas coming up into this country have been gassed, so they'll ripen on the way here. But the point is, it hasn't been much really changed about them. There's processed culinary ingredients, foods obtained directly from nature, then pressed, refined, ground, so that they can be used in cooking. And examples of this are sugar, vegetable oils, maple syrup maybe. Then there's, shall we say, processed foods. And they can be canned, frozen, baked, 1 to 2 added ingredients, such as breads, cheeses, pastas, yogurts. And then there's your heavily processed foods, sometimes just simply called junk food. And usually they have 5 or 6 or more ingredients with added sugar, oils, fat, salt. And examples of these are cookies, Fruit Loops, potato chips. This next slide came out of Food for Better Health. And again, it says processed, according to them, processed foods are harmful. And in there, they had I'm going to say that they had a questionable quote, and and it goes like this, quote, "A large number of resources are spent in making food pleasant to the brain that leads to overconsumption." I'll say that again. They say that a large number of resources are spent in making food pleasant to the brain that leads to overconsumption. Now that implies that there's kind of a big conspiracy in the food industry that somehow we're going to trick people into put something in the food that's going to trick them or lead them to eat more than they should without any care about what it does to their health or anything. And that's misleading. I know that all my years in food processing, basically all we wanted to do was process the product that we were making, make it wholesome, make it a quality product, and abide by the regulations, and at the end of the day, make a buck. There was never a time in my career that we said, hey, if we put this into this food or we do this or do that, they're going to eat a lot more than what they're eating now. So there is no grand conspiracy in food processing. And let's talk about a few of them. They talk about apparently processed food is bad too. Well, the first one they say is artificial ingredients. Well, to be fair, there maybe is a little bit of truth to that. Nitrates, which are often found in smoked meats like bacon or sliced meats perhaps, have been linked to various types of cancer. But on the other hand, I was in the flour milling business. We used to, by law, we added folic acid. And that was great because women getting a good dose of folic acid leads to less problems with spina bifida. So to say that foods are bad because of artificial ingredients, that's not entirely true. They can be good because of artificial ingredients. The next one is they're high in unhealthy fats. Well, again, maybe some truth. It depends what kind of fat it is. If it's we're talking about polyunsaturated fats, if it's high in omega-6, which is basically an inflammatory agent to some extent, it can lead to obesity and high blood pressure, whereas omega-3 fats are much healthier for you. The next one, we get wrapped because some foods are high in sugar. And foods can contain fructose, glucose, lactose, dextrose, high fructose corn syrup. It's all sugar. And there's no doubt about it, too much sugar is hard on the system. Simplest solution is moderation. Apparently, there's a feeling that processed foods can lead to weight gain. Well, I'm going to say that eating too much of anything is going to lead to weight gain. There's a thought that processed foods are low in nutrients. Well, maybe some truth to that. Higher levels of processing can lower the fiber or reduce the nutrient content, no doubt about it. They even say it can impair mental health. Well, again, I think the jury's out on that to some extent. Vitamin B foods can improve mental health. And again, we're talking about, and good old omega-3 can lower depression and some forms of ADHD. So I'm not too sure that that's a fair statement to say processed foods impair your mental health. So you can wreck your digestion. Well, some preservatives can throw off your digestive system. That said, there's a lot of foods I wouldn't want to eat if they didn't have some sort of preservative in them. There's a thought that processed foods are highly addictive. Well, I'll agree with that one. You put a lot of sugars, fat, or salt in anything like peanuts or popcorn, and you're sitting there watching the football game, it's hard to stop eating, no doubt about it. The next one is they say that processed foods promote food waste. Well, this one is kind of a thin argument. The thinking is that because a lot of processed foods are cheap, we're going to buy too much. Because we buy too much, we're going to throw away a lot. And I just don't buy that one. There's we do waste a lot of food, but I don't know if you can blame it all on processed foods. And the last one here is future generations will buy in. And the thinking there is that as time has changed, our moms aren't cooking as much, so the kids are eating a lot more processed foods, and that's become part of their lifestyle. They don't know any better, and when they grow up, become adults, they're just going to continue that right on with their kids. So I guess my takeaway on this, sure, there are some negatives, but the bottom line is moderation is what's needed. Eat too much of anything, you're going to get in trouble. The next one is carbs. Again, carbs get a bad rap. And again, we got to talk about what kind of carbs are we talking about? There's bad carbs, apparently. White bread, pasta, white rice, which lead to a high glycemic index, which causes a rapid rise in blood sugar, which in turn can lead to diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. And there's good carbs found in whole wheats, oats, and because of the fiber content, they get digested more slowly. And so it's a lower, gentler glycemic rise in blood pressure. And also gluten. How bad is it? Well, again, I'm tempted to say I think the gluten thing is overblown. There was a recent study by a food scientist by the name of Julie Upton, and she did a test study on a number of people, and she found that of all her test subjects, only 7% were truly intolerant to gluten. In other words, they were celiac. Yet 30% of shoppers are choosing gluten-free. 41% feel that non-gluten is beneficial. It's out there. You talk to people, don't say, oh, you eat too much gluten, you're going to get fat. It's not good for you. And again, it's a result of misinformation out there. The bottom line, again, we just simply have to do a better job of educating the public and making sure that they're making wise choices. Another challenge in the food industry is in processing is food safety. I'm going to say we've come a long way. And coincidentally, just as we've come a long way in food safety, we've come a long way in employee safety too. And not to get off track here, but just on employee safety, back when I started in the industry, if you went out in the plant, you basically just wore your street shoes, a bump cap, and a lab coat. Today, if you go out in the plant, you've got steel-toed boots, a hard hat, a lab coat, a hairnet, a face mask, an orange vest, and a name tag that indicates that you're allowed to be out there. I do know in my experience that back in the day, people were pretty loosey-goosey when it came to some elements of food safety. I know they used to play around with formulas, try to cut this ingredient out, try to add this ingredient because of whatever cost saving. In this day and age, that just doesn't happen too often. If there's a recipe out there in the plant, somebody gets caught deviating from it, they can probably get fired. But food safety is a big concern for a number of reasons. Maybe some of you will remember the Listeria outbreak with Maple Leaf in 2008. Listeria being a bacteria, and hundreds of people got ill, and about 25 died. And having worked for Maple Leaf back in the day, I think the irony of it is that in my view, Maple Leaf was probably one of the most food safety conscious companies I could think of. And if you think there's going to be a contamination issue of some sort, you tend to say, well, it's going to be some, small little place out in the middle of nowhere where mom and pop aren't paying attention to things and things get out of hand. But it did hit Maple Leaf hard. And as we all know, a recall can kill your business. And the other thing too is not only does it affect your business, it can affect the industry. After the Listeria outbreak with Maple Leaf, which was mostly in their sliced meats and bologna products, they struggled through that recall and actually did a good job of getting their reputation back in place. But can tell you that the category, sliced meats and sliced bolognas and those type of products, the total market of those went down significantly because they just didn't identify with product from Maple Leaf being unsafe, the public in general thought, gee, I think all these products are unsafe. But the good thing that came out of that listeria outbreak back in 2008, in my view, it was a wake-up call. And I can tell you, a lot of companies looked at how serious it was and how it impacted Maple Leaf. And a lot of companies, processing companies, got scared. And it was a good thing, because they all, or most of them all, embarked or took a look at their own operations and tightened up their food safety rules and regulations within their plants, and introduced various food safety programs. And I think personally that the food in North America, or at least in Canada, is probably a lot safer today than it was 10, 20 years ago. And I think a lot of it, again, is because that, as I say, that Maple Leaf thing was a wake-up call for a lot of companies. So, but it is an issue. I should mention too that a lot of customers are so concerned about food safety issues. In fact, before I retired, we actually had one customer we had literally x-rayed everything that came in their door. Now think about that. You're making flour, it's going into a plant, and they are literally x-raying everything that came in the door. That's how concerned they were about it. Now, next one, please. As we talked about traceability in the farm community, traceability is a big part of food safety. And again, record keeping is critical. In one of the food safety programs that a lot of companies have used is called HACCP, and that's Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. And this is a systematic preventative approach to food safety from biological, chemical, and physical hazards in production processes that can cause the finished product to be unsafe, and designs measures to reduce these risks to a safe level. I should add that shortly after that Maple Leaf recall, a lot of food retailers in Canada demanded that their supplier proved that they were HACCP certified. In other words, they wouldn't buy from you. So that too led to a lot more food service measures being put in place. So you might say, well, what is hazard analysis and critical control point? Well, basically what you do is you identify all the critical control points in your process. Let me give you an example. In the grain or the flour business, you have grain coming in. And as far as the grain cleaning goes, you have sieves and whatnot, screens, but you also have magnets. And the idea behind the magnets is they will pick up all metal that might be in the grain that's coming in your door. So with HACCP, you have to set up a schedule to check those magnets on an ongoing basis, every couple days or every 3 days. In some cases, is every day. So you have to go in, check the magnets. Are they working? You have to document, yes, they're working. You have to ensure that the person checking them has been trained how to check those magnets. Similarly, in the lab, there's obviously a bunch of tests that you do in the lab to make sure that your product is okay. So you have to keep records, and you have to document that you're checking your lab equipment on an ongoing basis. You have to make sure that they're calibrated. You have to document when they're checked. You have to document that the person who checked them is trained to check them. And sometimes it even goes so far to say, well, when are you going to retrain that guy? Give him upgraded training. So these are some of the things that take place to make sure that we put out a safer product. Next slide, please, Brian. key concern is organics. And what is organic food and why do some consumers prefer them over other foods? Organic foods are products that are farmed according to environmentally and social responsible approach and have been produced in accordance with organic production standards. In simple terms, it means the foods have been produced according to natural farming techniques. Organic food is produced without the use of pesticides, herbicides, inorganic fertilizers, and animals do not receive antibiotics, animal byproducts, and growth hormones. Livestock raised for meat, eggs, and dairy products are allowed to be outdoors and are given organic feed. The farming techniques used for organic products are the reason that organic foods are gaining traction as consumers perceive them to be better for health and more nutritious than conventional foods. So the big question is, it is questionable whether the extra cost of organics is worth it. Because, go to the next slide, please. Reading in the Food Safety Helpline, they quote, "There is no evidence that organic foods are more nutritious than conventional foods, though some studies show evidence of some differences in the nutrient content of organic and conventional foods." And to be fair, you know, there's another aspect to organics, not just the food you eat being organic. You know, if it is coming from an organic source, you, aside from nutrition, organic farming does engender better sustainability in the sense that, you know, perhaps they're not using various insecticides and fertilizers and what have you. So just to end my talk here, what does the future hold for agriculture? Well, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jim Prattley at the Charles Sturt University did a study, and he figures that in 2050, we'll need 70% more food than from the year 2000. World population will go from 7.4 to 9.1 billion. And also the other thing to consider is there's going to be more disposable income in the third world, leading to them to upgrade their eating habits and in some cases just simply eat more. I've listed some of the things that are probably going to happen. I think you're going to see more genetic engineering, more gene editing, better yields. And I think there's some good reasons for that. We can get plants that grow bigger, grow faster, require less fertilizer, require less water, allow us to grow some plants in semi-arid regions that we couldn't before. Grow more nutritious plants. I think you're going to see continued more health consciousness, more consumer demands. We're going to see more plant-based proteins. We're going to see more farm consolidation. As we talked about a little earlier, our current farmers, a lot of them are in their 50s and 60s, and they will retire. And in a lot of cases, no one to replace them. So farms are going to get fewer and larger. We're going to see ever increasing costs of farmland also, as I mentioned earlier. We're going to see more outside labor. We're going to see more robotic farm equipment. We're going to see more drone activity, monitoring crops, even delivering feed in some cases. We're going to see more sophisticated monitors, sensors that are going to be out in the fields, and they can monitor the water levels and be hooked up to the irrigation systems for more efficient use of water. We're going to see hydroponics becoming more popular. which leads, hydroponics will lead to reduced need for land, obviously. Much better control over plant environment, less use of less water because they're recycling it. Be able to take advantage of unused urban spaces. It will allow for year-round growing, and it'll eliminate the large-scale use of herbicides and pesticides, and which in turn will lead to greater sustainability. I guess the last point I've got here is a bit of a concern is there going to be more or less international trade? And are we going to have food wars? I mean, right now we're trading food back and forth. We've got a lot of problems with a few countries around the world, but yet we're still trading with a lot of them. And is there going to come a day where we're going to say to, China, we're not going to sell you any food anymore? That remains to be seen. And that's has a lot to do with politics and how we go forward in the future. So the next slide, as I finish up here, Brian, your takeaway, agribusiness will hold many, many new and exciting challenges and opportunities for you. The future of agriculture is yours to behold. Good luck to you all in the days ahead. So thank you. That's just a thank you to some of the people that helped me, Richardson's, PepsiCo, and of course my alma mater, P&H Milling Group. Any questions?
Thank you, Mike. Great presentation. Lots of material for thought. So I'm sure there'll be a few questions here. We've got a few minutes for questions. I will mention a couple of the comments on the chat session. You are what you eat. So there's quite a few interesting comments there. I'm ravioli because I always come with a surprise. I am yogurt because I am sweet and colorful. That's from Maria Amelia. So that's great. So any other comments about you are what you eat, or any comments or questions for Mike? And you can probably shut off the screen sharing there, Brian, if you wish to see everybody. And I see Vitor, you have a question for Mike?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Mike, I'm from Brazil, and I'd like to make a question for you. Thinking traceability, sustainability, organic products, plant-based products, and all of those market trends, how do you see the farmers in the future? Because here in Brazil, this is a big question that we have here about how the farmers here will develop their products, their management inside the farm to sell their products to the market. So how do you see this in Canada? How do you see the farmers in the future thinking in all of those market trends?
Oh, wow. Well, it's a good question. I think for starters, I think there was a day that if you're a farmer, you basically went out and said, I like raising cows and I like planting wheat, so that's what I'm going to do. And they would do that. They'd raise cows, they'd grow wheat, and everything was fine. But as time goes on, as I say, there's going to be a lot more challenges to some of that, because as I mentioned, in both cases, there's going to be needs for more documentation that they're going to have to take care of. I'm not too sure where just to kind of relay what I said, farmers in the future are there's going to be a continuing great need for education, because if you look at, as I say, the automation, the robotics, the drones, the sensoring systems, who's going to operate these? Farmers are going to have to be very knowledgeable in all that area. What else do I need to say? There could be more government concern about, as time goes on, about some of the fertilizers that they're using, or some of the insecticides. We think they're safe, they've been tested, they've spent years getting research, but we certainly found in some cases that we have to rethink some of these things. So, and of course, one thing I really didn't get into, but I think one of the biggest challenges for farmers is going to be high land costs. Obviously, there's only so much land out there, and there's an increasing need for it. So I think finance, like the point I made, is that it surprised me, 40% of all the farming in North America is on leased land. And most of the leased land is owned by retired farmers. So what does that tell you? It basically tells me that for whatever reason, somebody can't afford to buy it. I'm sure I think a lot of farmers that are leasing their land out would probably be fairly happy to sell it and get a good price. But why isn't all that leased land being bought? I think to some extent, maybe some of their children aren't interested in farming, but I think financing is a big issue. So, that's going to be a real big challenge moving ahead in the future. And of course, the other things I talked about too, more and more, like climate change. I mean, look at the grass fires we've had, look at the drought. We're going to have more droughts. We're going to have more flooding. So I think farming is going to be very, very rewarding in the years ahead. But with those rewards, I think there's just going to be all sorts of challenges that are going to face them. And I go right back to when we talked about the value chain. As time goes on, I think farmers are going to realize they have to be more dependent on that value chain. They're going to need help from government in certain areas. They're going to need help from trade associations. They're going to need help from research stations. So there's just going to be a lot more to farming in the days ahead, in a nutshell. I think, I don't know, Wayne, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, they've heard some of my story already this week, but I think you captured it pretty well. But I'd like to get to Marceli. I know she has a question.
Oh, okay.
Marceli, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Michael, excellent presentation. You addressed strong and important points for the future of agriculture. I feel that people are changing the concept of healthy eating all over the world. Many are become vegetarians and vegans. They don't eat in processed and canned foods. That's without carbohydrates, without the use of trans fat. I have many friends, for example, and many friends think and living like this. In my view, the trend is more and more for people to look for health foods. In your opinion, with this change in behavior in the medium and long time, what would be the challenge for the food industry?
In terms of, or I'm sorry, Marcel, in terms of what, organics or I'm sorry, I just didn't quite catch your last statement there.
In terms of everything, the actions, the food industry.
Challenges in the
The
food.
challenge, the concept, the peoples in the medium
okay.
or long time, the position in the food industry.
I personally, I think one of the biggest concerns, and I stress personally, is misinformation. And as I mentioned to you earlier, and that's not just in the food or the farm industry. I mean, sometimes I see things in the media that just, I don't know, I just shake my head. But there is a lot of misinformation out there. And one of the biggest challenges in the food industry is how do you counteract that? Now, I've been retired for 5 years now, but before I retired, the flour, as an example, the flour millers in Canada got together with the bakers in Canada because there was so misinformation about good carbs, bad carbs, gluten, don't eat bread, you're going to get fat, and all this type of stuff. And there's a lot of people out there that have that concern. So what's been going on is you're starting to see more collaboration between the processors and the retailers on these issues. And so they're setting up helplines where you can literally, in a lot of cases, phone a trade association. And if you got a question about carbs, you can go online, they'll have the answer for you. They're taking out ad space in various trade magazines that showcase the benefits of a lot of these foods. And it's a tough road to hoe, but they're just simply trying to get better information out to the consumer. It's quite a challenge, but it's just something that needs to be done. So I'm not, hopefully that answers your question.
I agree.
Thank you. No, I think it's a great way to, to end the week, Mike, and it's given us all something to think about, because I guess food, what we eat and value added is very critical, but it's really critical for Canadian producers. Again, as I've mentioned many times over the last 6 weeks, we export 75–80% of our production globally, and so we really have to demonstrate globally how safe and nutritious our food is. And so this is a very important issue for us, but it's also important for other countries, because I think it's misinformation, as you pointed out many times, is one of our biggest challenges. Social media, getting our scientists and food experts to speak up honestly, but we have to be transparent as well. So I think that's very, very critical. So I think you made that point very well. I see 1 or 2 hands here. We've got 4 or 5 minutes for our final couple of questions. So Rick, you want to go ahead first?
Yes, thanks, Wayne, and thanks, Michael, for your presentation. I fully agree with you on your comment about misinformation, and I think what has, I'll call it, accelerated the misinformation train is social media and the internet. You know, information, bits and bytes, and billions of bits and bytes are in the air every second of the day, and most people in the world have access to it, and it's almost like if it's on the internet, it's got to be true, it's got to be fact, and I think people who are trying to profess a different direction, their own personal agendas, I think have a tool that's available, readily available, and people tend to believe it. I think the other thing that really mostly bothers me, and it's not a question, it's just a comment, but I'm seeing evidence where politics trumps science. And I think that has we've got to stand up for the science, because that's our future. Because if we're expected to feed 9.4 million or billion people on this earth with less land available, because it's not being invented, that's a big challenge ahead of us. And so it's going to be a balance between our ability with technology through science to produce more effectively, more on every acre of land.
Well, yeah, yeah, and I think this thing that scares me, Rick, and all of you, is that there seems to be I'm going to say, a growing movement in society to not trust government, not believe government, not to believe the authorities. I try to be as objective as I can, but I take a look at this recent COVID thing. And I think if this COVID thing had happened 50 years ago, and a bunch of scientists said, look, you got to get in and get vaccinated and wear your mask and social distance, probably most people would say, yeah, I better do that because that's what they're telling me to do. Whereas look at the challenges that our scientific community is getting on COVID. And it gets into politics. And sadly, you're getting, I think, politicians that are saying things just so they can appeal to a certain group out there rather than say the things that are backed up by good science. And it's just a bit scary, so.
Yeah, it's called buying votes.
Yeah, we've never heard that before. But to your point, you think back like when I was a kid, you had every night at 6 o'clock, you had Walter Cronkite come on, and he would tell you something, and you believed it, because for starters, whenever story Walter Cronkite told you had been confirmed, it was a fact, or pretty close to being 100% accurate.
You're really dating some of us there, Mike. When you talk about Walter Cronkite. None of our participants know what we're talking about. John, you have a final question for Mike or comment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just, I was curious about, Mike, if you had any suggestions as to how we can attract more people, more young youth into the farming industry. Do you have any golden nuggets that we can help pass on?
Oh, wow.
Ownership is tough. I certainly understand that. I mean, the price per acre of land and farming is really, really high. I know I grew up in Iowa, so and all my buddies were farmers, and I live in the town of 5,000 people, so it was like I was in a farming community anyway. And so I know all all these farmers had kids, and the kids continued on, but with the farm, but that's not happened as much anymore.
Well, I grew up in a farm community back in southwestern Ontario, and back then in Ontario, southwestern Ontario, it was quite common for farms to be 100 acres, 200 acres. Yeah. And I talked about having a couple uncles that had farms. Well, the one uncle, it was 75 acres. And they did okay. It was a general farm. They had beef cattle, they had dairy cattle, they had an orchard, they had a tobacco barn, they grew tobacco, you name it, they did it. But it's changed society in the sense that if you go back to the same region now, there's very, very few 100-acre farms. If there are, it's probably a hobby farm. More likely, it's 1,000-acre farms, 2,000-acre farms, and owned by just a few people. And in the old days, you had all these little farms and everybody had 4 or 5 kids. Now you got these big farms and maybe they have 1 or 2 kids. It's had a big impact on the educational system back home. They're shutting down schools in southwestern Ontario in a lot of areas, particularly in the rural areas, because there just aren't the kids anymore. So maybe that's part of it. I think, again, getting back, I think financing is a big part of it.
Yeah. Oh, financing. Yeah, that's a good point. Good point.
I've always said I wish my parents. I would love to be a farmer. I think it'd be a great career, But
so maybe one way to do that is to encourage kids to become farmers. Is start off with a hobby farm. Say, just here for $8,000, you can start your own hobby farm, and you can plan to make an income of, I don't know, $60,000 or $70,000 and a lot of work, but at the end of the day, if we can show that cause and effect from a moral perspective, but also show it from from a monetary perspective in quality of living and type, that
Oh, yeah.
might be one way to
But,
do
you
it.
know, it is a problem. And, you know, a lot of people, Wayne and I met with gentleman from Trevor Lewington from Economic Development. Wayne, if you recall, he said in Southern Alberta right now, there's what, 5,000 unfilled positions, you know?
Yeah, no, it was pretty incredible when you said
Yeah.
there's 5,000 to 6,000 vacant jobs right now in the food processing, agricultural industry in Southern Alberta, 5,000 to 6,000 vacant jobs. So I think it's a challenge for not just our producers,
So,
but for food processing as well. So I know
so
we can carry on here, but I think I'd like to wrap it up. And before ending and thanking you, Mike, again for a great couple of presentations, I'd also wanted to give a heads up for Friday. And I see Thomas is still here. So Thomas, we're scheduled to have a presentation from agriculture in Argentina. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to share some of your experience and knowledge about agriculture in Argentina on Friday. So are you able to do that? Thomas, unmute. Or give me a thumbs up. We can't hear you, so. So I'm assuming that's positive, but we can't hear you, Thomas. So please let us know. Give me a thumbs up. Looks like we lost Thomas.
I think he's frozen, Wayne.
Yeah, no, I can see that, but I was hoping for a thumbs up before it's frozen. So we're going to assume he smiled like he was going to be able to accommodate us there. So we're looking forward to that, as well as doing a bit of a review. And I also want to remind the participants that are here today of their 1-minute videos and so on that we're hoping to have by this Sunday to send to, you know, to Margie or Graham about their thoughts over this learning process. So any final comments before we sign off here? Again, thanks Brian for helping out Mike, and thanks again, Mike, for a wonderful presentation. We'll have the video recordings put on our storage files, so others that weren't here today be able to contact or review that for the next few days. But thank you everyone for your participation today, and have a good couple of days, and we'll see many of you on Friday.
Bye for now.